Welcome viewers to the series Exploring Careers in the Green Economy. This episode is entitled, How Do We Get Meaningful Youth Engagement in International Environmental Policy? My name is Maria Tan, class of 2021 at Middlebury College, and I would like to introduce this episode's guest speaker. I'm joined today by Mika Tan, class of 2015, who currently holds roles as coordinator for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Center for Biodiversity, the co-founder and head of the steering committee for the Urban Biodiversity Hub, and the policy coordinator for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, Mika.
Thank you for having me.
Mika, this series explores a number of different professional areas involving the green economy. I'd like to know more about the multiple roles that you currently hold, starting with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Center for Biodiversity. Give us a bit about its mission and its history, and then we can go into your other organizations.
All right. Well, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, or ASEAN here stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is headquartered in the Philippines, although I'm calling right now from Singapore, my home country. We're established in 2005 as a response, a regional response of the Southeast Asian nations to the biodiversity crisis that's happening regionally and also globally. And this center just coordinates all of the responses of the 10 different countries that are part of ASEAN, and also as a region, our coordinated response to many of the policy matters that are happening on the global level. And we're sort of an interface between many other international institutions and governments, and also with the governments of ASEAN. So ASEAN, if you were to think about an analogy, it's sort of like a mini United Nations just for this region. We have 10 countries in ASEAN, and that's Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos PDR, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And we are all situated within Southeast Asia, the geographic region. There's actually one more country, Timor-Leste, in the Southeast Asia region, but they're not politically part of ASEAN as of yet. So you can think of it as sort of in the EU, you have EU member states, but you also have other countries within Europe that's not part of the EU. But a slight difference between ASEAN and the EU is that we go by consensus, and we're not national. What that means is that we are, every single country stands for itself and has equal voting rights. Whereas in the EU, there's also a supranational structure where the EU itself is also elected by the citizens of the European Union. So there's some slight difference there. But if you learn a little bit more about international relations, you might find that it's fascinating that we have all these different structures based on the circumstances of the region and what the countries and what the citizens here wish to have as a representation of themselves. But okay, that was a brief introduction to ASEAN, which is a really, it's a different thing altogether, but my specific center is the Center for Biodiversity. And we, as I said, we coordinate the biodiversity responses. So it's either on the policy side or in implementing projects in the region, for example, related to protected area management. Or in my case, my role is about youth empowerment to ensure young people get involved in policy matters or other biodiversity matters in the region.
Yeah, and then going into the Urban Biodiversity Hub, which is the organization that you co-founded. Could you tell us a bit more about the reason why you started the organization and its mission and its history of it?
Well, this was a very interesting venture. I mean, it is still a very interesting venture for me. We started in December 2016, so we're 4 years and a bit old. The Urban Biodiversity Hub really came together because I was at a conference and I met some people who were very interested in, and I met my co-founders who were very interested in ensuring that all the resources out there that's available about biodiversity in urban spaces, in urban contexts, can be used by city officials and local governments, because there's a treasure trove of information out there, but it's scattered and it's difficult to find. It's difficult to Google and know what's relevant and useful for your city, because you might be a desert city, you might be a tropical city, you might be with lots of water resources, or you might be with none of them. And so what does it mean for you as a city to plan taking nature into account, ensuring that you are planning with nature instead of planning against it? And a lot of this has got to do with the health and well-being of urban citizens. For example, the lack of green spaces in an urban space is known to lead to increased temperature and urban heat within a confined space where there's tons and tons of concrete buildings, which makes it really difficult for energy demand, because you then need lots more air conditioning, or if electricity is expensive, then you need a lot more ways to cool yourself down. And we know that in India, for example, many cities have problems with urban heat, and when there are heat waves, many people actually do get sick from that. So how do you plan with nature? How do you ensure that flood waters are being managed without excessive cost and lots of infrastructure that is man-made, that requires a lot of maintenance, that's also expensive and inaccessible for a lot of the cities in developing countries in the world. So we've collated all of these resources about urban biodiversity solutions and put that together on our website, uphub.org. And also we're working in the background, partnering with cities to try and ensure that we have a platform that's useful for them, that would allow them to access all of this information and find out what's useful for their contexts, so that they can plan with biodiversity in mind.
Yeah, that sounds super cool. Which governments are you currently working with on that, or is it for a lot of the organizations within ASEAN?
Oh, for Urban Biodiversity Hub, it's actually a global initiative. So we're not necessarily fixed on any particular location. And all of us are professional collaborators from all across the world. My team has the core team is about 5 to 6 of us, but we have volunteers from at least 16 different countries globally that help to maintain the database and work on some of our research projects. And the partner cities that we have range from areas around the US, Canada, also around here in Asia, Singapore, and there are many of our volunteers who are from the different countries also have connections to the cities in their regions. We have people in Mexico and others working in Peru as well. So I guess you can see our global reach also on our website.
Yeah. So it's like a volunteer crowdsource organization.
You could put it in that sense. So we sort of curate all of this information insofar as long as it's publicly accessible, it would be, and if we know of that data source, we would put that on our database that's on our website. And yes, we do welcome lots of input from anybody who is interested to share about what their city is doing for biodiversity. If, for example, they have a plan for it, or if they have certain projects that make use of nature.
And if any of our viewers want to go to your website, what would that be to check it out?
That's www.ubhubuphub.org.
Okay, thank you. And then moving on to the last organization that you're currently working with, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Could you explain a bit more about that?
So it sounds as if I have lots of jobs, but honestly, only one of them pays me. The other ones are things that I do in my own time, or are part of, or different hats that I wear. So different roles that I take, but they all revolve around conservation. And generally speaking, they also touch upon policy in terms of the aspect of conservation that I'm looking at. So the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, or GYBN, is the official youth constituency for the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. That's a long kind of an explanation, and it might not make sense at first, but if you think about, I'm sure many of you know the Paris Agreement, which is part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what that means is that so many countries in the world has signed on, are signatories of the Convention on Climate Change. And similarly, there is a convention, a sister convention for biological diversity, and that's the CBD. And so in all of these spaces, you have different stakeholders that take part in the discussions and the negotiations. So governments are just one, governments or parties, as we call them, because they are signatories to the convention. They are the voting members of the convention, and so they attend the discussions. We also have civil society that attends the discussions, and international organizations. So for example, WHO, WTO, or other arms, the UN Environment Programme, all of these other institutions of the United Nations. And so the Global Youth Biodiversity Network falls under the civil society umbrella of attendees. And what we do is that we're a youth constituency. So we coordinate the youth response and participation in the CBD processes to ensure that young people's voices are adequately represented in the discussions, in the negotiations, so that they don't forget that all of this that they're discussing about, the policies for biodiversity, is going to affect us now and into the future.
Mm-hmm. You work mainly with youth and bringing youth into this space. What are the main challenges in working in this area?
Main challenges working in this area. I think you'd have, if you think about youth empowerment and bringing and ensuring that youth voice is represented, there are actually kind of two main sides to it. The first side is on the youth end, ensuring that young people are informed, ensuring that young people have the space to discuss and to represent themselves, to ensure that we have sufficient representation from all different groups of young people, because although we're all, depending on the definition and where you are in the world, generally speaking, we're all around the age of 15 to 35. In some countries, it's 15 to 25, in some it's until 30. But generally, we're in this transition period in life from being a dependent to an independent person and finding our place in society. So on the youth end, there are all those challenges about ensuring that we can adequately represent ourselves, and that we understand the issues at stake, and that we understand that our voice matters. Because in certain societies, we're taught to think that young people are supposed to listen to the adults, and that they don't know better for themselves, which we know is not true. But trying to break that, that mindset that people have grown up with their entire lives, where they're not, in certain places, it's not okay to ask the teacher a question because that's a challenge on their authority. In cases like that, ensuring that young people feel that ownership and that their voice matters is one aspect. So that involves lots of capacity building and training and empowerment. Then on the other hand, because as much as young people want our voices to be heard, it's a two-way street. Who will hear our voices? It would be the decision makers. So the other challenge on that end, on the decision makers end, is trying to show that young people are valuable partners in the process and that we're not threats. We're not just unhappy about things and wanting things to change for the sake of it, but that we actually understand why things are not working for us now, and therefore why we want them to change. We may not know all of the solutions, and it's actually not fair to expect young people to know all the solutions to our problems, but it is in our right to be able to share that what we feel about the current situation, how we think the approaches, the ways in which we should be involved in order to make things better for our future. And in that sense, working on both ends, it's also about building that relationship, building the trust, letting young people see that decision makers sometimes just don't know how to interact with young people in a way that respects our views. And so it's not as if the adults know everything either, but again, to learn from wisdom, learn from things that have happened before, and understanding how that is relevant to our situation, and what has changed such that things need to change. And then on the decision makers end, to build the trust that young people are partners. They're not adversaries. We are here because we want our collective future to work out for all of us.
Do you feel like the decision makers are receptive to youth coming into the space?
I think that's gonna be different everywhere you ask. Different countries, different districts within a country, and sometimes even down to who's in charge. You may have certain administrators or people in power who are very amenable to the idea of listening to different stakeholders and believing that young people should have a voice. And then you also have others who have not had that ever in their lives. They've always known that as you get older, as you climb up the ladder, things are as they should be, where the younger ones or the subordinates listen to the higher ups, and that's what they've known their whole lives. They're not sure what other mechanisms work. They're just they just might not know, and therefore it's important to do awareness raising and also capacity building on both ends. But what's difficult here is that the level of power is different. You can imagine that the amount of power a decision maker holds is more than what the power of just a general young person might hold. And so that's where we have to be careful that even though there's a lot of interest on both sides to try and meet some in some way, the amount of power held by the different entities are different.
Yeah. Going back to your first organization, your paid job, which organizations or governments do you frequently collaborate with? The Asian Center for Biodiversity.
Yeah, so we are answerable to the 10 ASEAN member states that I listed before, but we also work with many different governments across the world in order to make things happen in the region. And we have partnerships and collaborations with, for example, the European Union. In fact, the project that I'm working on is funded by the European Union about ensuring protected areas are better managed in this region. That's one example. We also work with the government of Korea, Japan, India, and also with many other international organizations. So if you can imagine, the secretariat of the conventions themselves also partner with us to do some sub-regional or regional consultations or workshops or projects that would then help with delivering on the outcomes of the convention. Other institutional funders or donors that we work with include, for example, the Global Environment Facility. So we would work with the countries, although the process there is a little bit more complicated. So we would work with the countries to work together with the GEF on certain projects or proposals. And of course, we work directly with many other countries or many of the countries in this region on national projects or regional projects. So there are many different scales here. There's national scale, the regional scale, and also the global scale.
Yeah. Working with different organizations, like you mentioned with the United Nations or different countries, are there any like challenges or barriers, since there seems to be like a lot of bureaucracy?
Ooh. Bureaucracy is something you can never escape. And as much as, and I mean, even within ASEAN, the diversity of how, of the different bureaucratic processes and how people think about bureaucracy can be a challenge, but it also reflects quite a bit on how the society is. And that's it's just something that we learn along the way. There's no textbook about bureaucratic processes in different countries. There may be in management, but I'm not from that field. But I guess if you think about it, bureaucracy is built over time. So it's also not something that you can change overnight just because you feel like it's so frustrating to fill 10 forms in order to do one thing. And even within the organization, there are processes in place. And often it's because the money that we work with are taxpayer funds. We have to be accountable to the money that comes to us, which is paid by other citizens just like me in the region, and who want our money, our tax money, to be used in a way that's accountable, that's going to benefit the region. So yes, you cannot escape it, but there's a reason for it. But that doesn't mean that that you should therefore accept it and let it be. I'm always a fighter, so I always question whether it's the bureaucratic processes that determine your outcome, or whether it's your objectives that should determine your outcomes. And how then can all these administration and different levels that you have to go through, how can that help you in achieving your objectives, rather than letting that decide the level of implementation or ambition that you can get to?
Yeah. Could you go into a bit more of like your goals currently with ASEAN, and kind of like maybe a bit more like a project you're working on and how that furthers the greater mission?
So I have quite a lot of ideas and projects in mind, but what I do is, or my role in the ACB, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, is to run or to coordinate the ASEAN Youth Biodiversity Program. And what that means is that I do program design and development. So in a nutshell, it's like, for example, if you had this main objective of increasing youth voice in the region for biodiversity matters, what do you do to achieve that? How can you get there through your specific role in your specific organization? At which entry points do you have more of an advantage in? There are tons of empowerment programs out there. What makes you different? So how do you design programs or projects that would allow you to reach that goal? So that's sort of what I do. So conceptually, I'm often working on designing how a program would, what kinds of target audience I want for the program, because within youth, you have many different subcategories or subgroups of young people. So which ones make the most sense in terms of the kinds of activities that I want to do with them. And I can give you an example. So one of the programs that I'm working on is called the Youth Biodiversity Leaders Fellowship, or the YBL Fellowship. And what we do is we select young biodiversity leaders in the region so that we provide them with in-depth training and support, institutional support and resources in order for them to raise their current, their existing biodiversity impacts to the next level. So we're looking at people who are already in the field, working on many different kinds of projects, which could include, for example, wildlife management. It could include getting communities involved in coastal cleanups. It could include working with farmers and other local communities that are using biodiversity, that are dependent on biodiversity, and allowing them to have stewardship and ownership of the natural resources that they rely on and how to use them sustainably. It could be people that are in the urban space and working on awareness raising projects in schools, for example. So we sort of nurture these leaders and provide them with connections to different decision makers in their countries or regionally or globally, so that they can connect what they're doing on the ground with what's happening in terms of policy in their countries or policy that's on the global level. That's one program, and that's one way to get young people's voice included in biodiversity conservation. Then I also run another program, which is called Youth Internships in Protected Areas. And that one targets a different subset of young people, people who are interested in knowing more about protected area management and natural resource management, but may not necessarily have the exposure yet. And we provide youth internship opportunities. Well, right now it's a little difficult because of COVID, but that aside, we would be able to provide internship opportunities with a small stipend so that we ensure that internships are not only accessible to people who have the financial means to not have a paid position. And that's the equity part of this is also a big part of what I do. And so we provide them with the on-the-job training and exposure so that they can understand better, is conservation a career that they would like to get into? We also are very open to, and this is something I learned from Middlebury, being interdisciplinary about it. It doesn't matter if they're not from like a biological field of study, as long as what they're working on, as long as their skills and expertise is required by the parks for example, looking at tourism satisfaction or looking at a business plan development. Those kinds of skills that are required are different from what you'd get if you have just a pure biology or ecology degree. And so we are trying to also open up the space and let people understand that conservation is not just something for the natural sciences. It's something that all fields should be contributing to. So that's another example of a different program that I run, but yet that still does expose young people to conservation, and so that they can find their place within this larger field. So in a nutshell, it's like there's a lot of, it's program design and also monitoring, ensuring that what programs that I'm running actually achieves their objectives, and the indicators that you would measure in order to know whether you are doing well or not and what to change.
Yeah, thank you for that. You mentioned a bit about how Middlebury has taught you a bit about like interdisciplinary work. And I noticed that you're an environmental studies major when you were here. Were there any other skills or things that you took away from your Middlebury experience, like coursework that has prepared you for this work?
Definitely. So I am one of the lucky people that knew what I wanted to do for my major coming into Middlebury. And it's okay if any of our viewers are not there yet. That's fine. I was one of the lucky ones. But what I did was I was very intentional with my choices of courses. So besides the minimum that I had to do for my environmental studies degree, I made sure to take anything and everything else that would expose me to different ways of thinking and different ways of looking at conservation. So I did architecture, I did computer science, I also did theater, I did psychology and literature a little bit. And through all of these different experiences, I was able to see how people think differently about anything in the world. And therefore, even if I'm not coming from a background in, for example, the performing arts, I could still see that the kinds of values, the kinds of ways in which people engage with others, with the living world, it can be very different. And I bring that into the work that I do. So for a lot of the workshops that I run online and in person with some of the youth leaders through the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity and also through my work with GYBN, I teach this thing called systems thinking. And that's really, it's really asking people to think much more critically about how interconnected all these different issues are, including poverty, including hunger, including pollution. Everything that's in climate is related to biodiversity, is related to pollution, is related to inequalities. But because the system is so complex, then where do you find your role? How do you know where the leverage points are based on your current situation or the resources that you have access to? How can you change your way of thinking in order to better persuade someone else that might hold more power within that space? So all of this sort of came not from any particular class in Middlebury, but really it was the entirety of the liberal arts experience and being able to have access to really awesome professors and students. A lot of my peers were also thinking about certain issues similar and just not sure what to do because everything seems so complex. And it's almost, sometimes you'd think that being in the environmental world is quite a pessimistic place to be. But I find optimism because people are striving really to find solutions, to find ways to do things that are equitable, that are just, that no longer exploits not just the natural world, but also that no longer exploits humans in getting to where we need to be. So that's just one aspect of the Middlebury experience that has helped me out.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very good for our viewers who want to know a bit more about your journey at Middlebury. And then continuing off of that, what was your first job out of Middlebury and how did you get to where you are today?
Whoa, my first job? So my first job after Middlebury was working for a marine biology lab as an editorial assistant in Chile. And at that time, I had taken up this job because a friend had introduced me to it. And I was also looking for something completely different in terms of the living experience from what I had known. I had grown up in Singapore my entire first 18 years of my life, and then I moved to the States for Middlebury, and those were the only two situations that I knew. And both are developed countries. Singapore by no means is anywhere close to rural or anything. So I experienced that shift from being in highly urbanized to being in a very rural place in the US. But both are still developed countries. And I really wanted to get a sense of something else. I wanted to learn something different that was a life experience. So I took up that job. And I was in a small university town along the coast of Chile called Coquimbo. And through that experience, although professionally speaking, I learned that I wasn't necessarily doing something that I didn't already know. And that actually stifled what I wanted to do. And I felt sort of like I was stagnant there because what I was doing was editing manuscripts for logical flow, for their English, for all the details, like, is there an Oxford comma here? Should this have been, should this reference have been number 17 instead of number 18, making sure everything aligned and things like that, which I felt I wasn't growing, professionally speaking. But in terms of my life experience, I had learned so much. I learned Spanish for one. I went there knowing no Spanish. I was like, no hablo español when I got there. But I learned Spanish. I learned a very different way of life, and also made a lot of friends in a part of the world that I had never even thought about being in Latin America, and understanding how politics works, generally speaking, how different societies are in different continents. And that was just one small example. But those experiences really enriched me as a person. But at some point, I knew that I had gained enough in that aspect of why I took that job, and that I needed to move on from there. So through that, I've learned that in a job, you look for, at least for me, this is how I kind of think about looking for jobs. There are three aspects in a job that you should think of and consider. So one would be the actual, the field that the position is in. So in this case, it was within science publishing. It was about natural sciences. So that's quite well within what I was very familiar with from Middlebury, because I was a conservation biology focus for environmental studies. And then the next thing is sort of your actual job scope, or what you're doing about in this field, right? So in my case, I was doing a lot of editorial work. So like I said, going through the manuscripts and just ensuring things, fit as how they should be for the publishers. That was sadly something that wasn't enough for me. And then the third part of it is sort of the connections that you can gain from this experience. And so the connections could be your coworkers, your superiors, the partners that the organization works with, the environment that the organization is in. For example, if you're in somewhere on Wall Street in New York, you'd be in and amidst all of the hedge funds and all of those people, right? But if you're in DC, you'd be amongst all the think tanks and all of the people that work with government. If you're somewhere else, maybe you're in Vermont, you might be surrounded by people who care a lot about the local community and different kinds of issues would be on the forefront of people's minds and the organizations there. So with these three aspects in mind, they don't all have to align, but just to be aware that by taking up this job, which of these aspects, it could be two of them, it could be one of them, it could be all three of them if you're lucky, that you'd be able to learn and gain from. And so I went into this job really thinking about the experience that I would be getting outside of my professional life.
Yeah, thank you for the advice for our viewers. What academic background do you think is most suited for a role like yours, and do you think an advanced degree is necessary? And also, what important skill sets would be crucial to going into this field?
Okay, so academic background and skill set, right? I think those were the two main points. So academic background, as I mentioned before, because conservation is something that all fields should contribute to. In fact, I don't think there should be any fixed kind of academic background in order for you to contribute to conservation and climate action. In fact, sometimes I think that we have way too many scientists on the job, and we need more people who do other things, who do arts, people who think about society more than the natural side of things, people who work with other people, people who are in finance, especially because all sectors of society require financing to be able to grow, to be able to function. So if we don't have allies in all of these different industries, we're not going to be able to break out of our silo. We're not going to be able to achieve the systemic change that needs to happen in order for the world to be more in harmony with our finite resources. And so I guess I'm skirting around the point, but for whichever academic background you're in, there is a role for you to play. And you'd have to find that perhaps through talking to others who've done that in the field, or speaking to CCI is a good start for one. And then the second one, skill sets. I think what's good is if you can work on some projects that get you out of school, that is not just academic. The real world is complex, sometimes makes no sense, sometimes is completely unpredictable, and things don't work the same way in the real world as in a class where you need a structured environment to be able to get your grades, to be able to fulfill certain requirements. So get yourself into projects that would get you out of class, so that you can learn flexibility. You can learn how to work with different people who may have completely different values and skill sets from you. How do you complement them? How do you understand where you are in and what your own strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and then to work on those. So less about the specific skills, but rather what you can do to find out what your skill sets are. But generally speaking, within the space that I work, which isn't just about biodiversity, but also international relations, there's a lot of people-to-people skills that you'd need. It's often not okay in my field to just straight up tell someone that, hey, this is not going to work. Or often you'd have to read between the lines. It's what people don't say that matters a bit more than what they actually do say. So being able to catch that comes with experience. It's not something you can just read and be good at. Some people would be better at it than others, but it's all got to do with putting yourself in situations where you can learn from and being intentional about it. So I mentioned earlier, being intentional in your classes, in your choices, in the things that you do, so that with every activity, you always think about and reflect upon, what have I learned from this? What's useful? What's not useful, so that I know better to avoid these kinds of things in the future.
Mika, thank you once again for your engagement with us in helping students prepare for their first career destinations. This concludes this episode within the series Exploring Careers in the Green Economy. In closing, I want to encourage our viewers to tune in to get more career perspective and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in this series. I want to encourage you to tune into other MIDDVantage series, which can be accessed through the Events and Programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you again for watching.